Hello, welcome back to the World Politics Show. So, as you'll remember, our previous episodes focused on realist theories of world politics. You probably feel like that was so clear and convincing that you are realists now, right? Well, don't get too settled in that view because we're now going to talk about liberal theories of world politics. And by the end, you may have completely changed your mind. Now, we're going to divide this into three parts because there are three different varieties of liberalism. Just as with realism, we had defensive realism, offensive realism. We have different varieties of liberal theory. So let's first off start by drawing some contrast with realism. Well, even before that, perhaps I should um, talk about the label liberalism. Um, in American politics, we refer to um, the left side of the political spectrum as liberal. We think of Democrats as liberal and Republicans as conservatives. But in the way we're using the term here, liberalism is much broader, and it really is rooted in the 19th century and the rise of liberal theory in the form of Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mills, who developed ideas about politics that and representation that differed from the traditional religious institutions as well as feudal and monarchical institutions. So liberalism was really focused on a set of ideas dealing with individualism, free market capitalism, um, individual rights and like civil liberties, um, limited role for government, and its later varieties, democracy. So those were some of the essential ideological elements of liberalism. Those are all things that conservatives in the United States would agree to as well. So in that sense, much of American political debate takes place among different varieties of liberal liberal ideology. But it can also be used to understand international politics. It can be applied in the international arena. And when we do that, we find that liberalism differs from realism in a number of ways. First of all, liberals believe in progress. It's really an enlightenment philosophy. So the notion is that humans can perfect themselves. They can learn from the past. They can develop new ideas and technologies, that change is largely a good thing. Um, it kind of liberalism disassociates itself from the notion that we live, for instance, in a kind of um, under unchanging and or even cyclical type um, of social order. Now, realism, on the other hand, believes that um, international politics really doesn't change. It's anarchic. It's made up of self-regarding, self-interested states that are responsible for their own security, and that hasn't changed in hundreds of years. It's unlikely to change until we have some kind of world government. So, in that sense, um, whereas liberals focus on the things that change over time, realists focus on the things that remain the same over time. Um, One of the consequences of liberalism, if we're trying to explain war, is that they believe we can figure out ways to solve conflicts short of war. We can figure out systems that disincentivize war or make war less likely. Um, Another contrast is that realists, as we said, treat all states the same. They don't differ as to, well, it's not that they don't differ as to religion, culture, political system, etc. It's that realists abstract away from those internal features. They think that when it comes to foreign policy, states all have similar motivations. They just want to survive or they want to gain power, And so therefore, we don't really need to look inside states to see what their domestic orders look like or how they differ. Whereas liberals believe that domestic politics actually does matter and that states have more than just security in mind or power in mind. They have other motivations, and that often the sources of war and conflict are internal. And in fact, from a liberal standpoint, um, some kinds of states are more warlike than other kinds of states. So you can say that the the likelihood of war is a product of the relative abundance of bad states versus good states, in a sense. And then finally, you'll recall the notion of a security dilemma that arises under anarchy, according to realists. And there, the notion is that what the steps one state takes to make itself more secure make its neighbor less secure, and you get a cycle of hostility. Well, liberals don't deny that that's true, but they believe that there are ways that states can overcome that cycle, can lessen the security dilemma through trust building, through institution building. And they also believe, unlike realists who think that states judge threats solely by looking at other states' capabilities, because after all, intentions can vary or change over time. Liberals argue that states also look at intentions. And so two other countries that have the same capabilities, they have similar size armies, for instance, may be viewed one as very threatening and one as not threatening at all, depending upon their domestic systems and how compatible those are with the state that's making the threat assessment. Okay. Let's then mention that there are three types of liberalism, three varieties of liberalism, all of whom which start with the premises that we've just discussed. Those are institutional liberalism, democratic liberalism, and commercial liberalism. We'll spend one lecture on each of them. So let's start with institutional liberalism. Basically, the argument here is that voluntary cooperation among states through international institutions can lessen the dangerous consequences of international anarchy. So for realists, the only way to lessen the consequences of anarchy is to develop a central authority, a global government, so to speak, that would impose its will upon all countries and create a world government that provided security to every country or every people, so that you move out of anarchy toward hierarchy. Liberals believe that there is something in between, that you can, even if you don't have a world government to ensure security, states can nevertheless, through voluntary cooperation, create institutions that lessen the degree of distrust and lessen the security dilemma. Now, to understand this, we have to start with a couple of concepts. Let's start with the difference, for instance, between relative and absolute gains. These are describing different outcomes that states might seek through their interaction with one another. It's really focused on two different kinds of games, so to speak. One is called a zero-sum game. Zero-sum game focuses on relative gains, and there the players, like for instance in poker, there's a winner and there's a loser, and the gains to the winner always match the losses to the loser, and therefore the sum of the two ends up being zero. So in that kind of game, it's impossible for both sides to win. There's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser. And that's depicted here through these two circles. It's a little bit hard to read, but the blue circle says, my interests, what's best for me. I win, you lose. Your interests, what's best for you. You win, I lose. there's no overlap between these two sets of interests, and therefore the game is a cutthroat competitive game. A good example is slicing a pie. So the bigger my slice, the smaller everybody else's slices. So it's impossible for me to increase my slice of the pie without reducing the amount of pie available to everybody else. So that's an example of a zero-sum game where the actors are pursuing relative gains, relative meaning that it's impossible that you're looking at the standing of one versus another. Now, a non-zero-sum game focused on what we call absolute gains is one where it's possible for both sides to win. It's also possible for both sides to lose. That if you add up the gains and the losses, there is a positive sum. It could be that one actor's, ends up 1 unit better off than before the game started, and the other actor 3 units better off. In which case, the total gains to the two sides are 4 units, but they're distributed unequally, but everybody ends up on the positive side. So that's a win-win type of game. And that's depicted here by these two circles that depict my interests and your interests. They overlap. So there is an area where it's possible for both of us to win. There are also areas where, we are at odds, where I can win and you lose, or you win and I lose, but those are not entirely disparate. So, for instance, if we work together, we could create a bigger pie, and that would allow us, in theory, to each have a bigger slice, right? Now, that doesn't guarantee that we each have a bigger slice. It's possible, because there are still some conflicting interests, it's possible that, I could take a slice so big that even though the pie is bigger, you still end up with less than you started with. So absolute gains and relative gains are different types of objectives that states might have in the international system. And these are represented in international politics by looking at power versus wealth. Relative gains, power is a relative gains seeking objective, meaning that in order for me to have more power, you have to have less power. It's impossible for us all to be winners. Power is relative in that we're looking at rankings. If China is rising in power, by definition, other countries have to be losing relative power. And if we want to just look at the U.S. and China in their bilateral relationship, then if China is growing in power, the U.S. is by definition losing power. It's just like the slicing up the pie. If China's piece is getting bigger, ours must be getting smaller. So if states worry most about pursuing power, which is what realists believe their main objective is, then we have this cutthroat zero-sum competition where one side wins, the other side loses. One side gains more power, the other side necessarily loses power. And in that case, it's a very, we have a very competitive world with cooperation being almost impossible. Now, on the other hand, what if, states worry not only about power, but what if they worry about wealth? What if states define part of their objective as simply making their people better off, increasing their absolute income, their welfare? And of course, there are pressures from internally on states just to pursue the welfare of their own people. Now, it's possible with wealth, everybody can get wealthier at the same time, right? Great Britain, in terms of its ranking among world powers, has fallen tremendously from, say, 1870 to the present. But at the same time, the British people are much better off in absolute terms, right? They're much wealthier, their income's higher, their standard of living is better than it was in 1870. So, in terms of wealth, which is an absolute good, uh, Britain is better off. In terms of power, it's worse off. So, it's very important then whether we believe that states mainly pursue power, which is what realists argue, or if states mainly pursue wealth, which is what liberals argue. Liberals think that we can all make the pie bigger by cooperating, and that lessens the competitive pressures of world politics. Now, when then would we expect states to pursue power? When would we expect them to pursue wealth? Well, consider that why do you pursue power? You pursue power because you face insecurity. Insecurity is a product of anarchy and the fact that states are forced to rely upon their own self-help for security. So they have to compete for security. And because the security dilemma, it forces them to worry about one another's military capacity. Well, okay, but remember we said that at some points in time and in some places, the offense has the advantage over the defense, meaning it's easier to take territory, to carry out aggression, than it is to hold territory or to defend. On the other hand, there are other circumstances where it's easier to defend territory than to take it. So countries that are on the defense actually have an advantage over the aggressor. Now, in the first case, aggression is easy and therefore commonplace, and therefore states have to worry a great deal about power. They want to build up as much military as they can to try to stay safe. On the other hand, if the defense has the advantage, then states don't have to worry quite as much about power because even if the aggressor has a slight numerical advantage, that's probably not enough to overcome an entrenched defense. And therefore, you don't even have to feel the need to match the other side weapon for weapon or soldier for soldier. You can feel relatively secure unless their advantage grows, to some very large level. Now, what does that mean? It means that in a world where the offense has the advantage, states worry about power, relative gains become the most important objective of foreign policy, and therefore conflict is common and pervasive, and cooperation is very difficult. But if the defense has the advantage, then the security dilemma is lessened. States can focus on other goals than security, and they may focus on wealth. They find that actually cooperation allows them to each gain wealth and have a win-win outcome, a positive-sum game. Well, and in that case, cooperation becomes much more likely, conflict tends to decline, and war becomes, unprofitable, so to speak. So whether realism is the best theory to describe world politics or liberalism is the best theory depends on that balance between offense and defense, because that tells us how insecure states are. Very insecure if the offense has advantage, less insecure if the defense does. So in some ways, liberalism is best suited to describe a world where the defense has the advantage. Now, what liberals will argue is that the defense typically has an advantage, and it's more common than for the offense to have the advantage. They also argue that defense dominance can actually be engineered through arms control or other kinds of international agreements, so that it's possible to move from an offense dominant to a defense dominant world through international cooperation. So what I've just suggested then is maybe we don't have to choose between these theories and say one is always right, one's always wrong. Maybe realism is right under some conditions and liberalism is right under other conditions. The question then becomes, at a given point in time, such as today or in the future, which conditions apply and which theory is best suited to those conditions. Now, here's another way of looking at the institutional liberalism. Let's imagine a spectrum here. And we already looked at these little circles, each representing the interests of different countries. Let's start on the left side where we have, it looks like one circle. Actually, it's two circles, but one, they perfectly line up so that there's one on top of the other, and therefore you just see it appears to be just one. But there are actually two circles there, right? This is a situation of harmony where the interests of the two countries are perfectly aligned. What that means is that whatever acts country A engages in to pursue its own interests, those acts will also serve the interests of country B. Whatever country B does to serve its own interests also serve the interests of country A, because the two countries' interests, there's no difference between them. They're perfectly aligned. We call that harmony, and that is unrealistically idealistic. We don't have examples of actual harmony in world politics. But, theoretically, that's at one end of a spectrum. The other end of a spectrum would be discord. And that's where, that's that relative gains game that we talked about before, the zero-sum game, where in fact there's no overlapping interests. The interests are entirely divergent, and one country's interests, if one country pursues acts that, if one country behaves in a way to pursue its own interests, that will create conflict with the interests of the other country. So that's called discord. Realists argue that discord is common in world politics. Liberals argue that no, it's not. It's also rare, just like harmony is rare to the point of being non-existent. Absolute discord is also very rare, maybe even non-existent. Liberals argue that much more common, most of world politics takes place in the middle. And that's the game we've touched on already, where there are differing but also overlapping interests, mixed interests. Now, this is where cooperation arises, the need for and the incentive for cooperation. Because under harmony, countries don't have to negotiate anything. When I pursue my interests, it automatically helps you. I don't have to try to find common ground. It just happens, right? It's automatic. On the other hand, with discord, there's nothing. The interests are so divergent. There's nothing to negotiate over. There's no common ground. There's no compromise. There's nothing that would allow us to find, be better off other than just winning. Liberals argue that most world politics is in the middle, so that there are conflicting interests, but if we negotiate, if we each adjust our behavior to take into account the interests of the other side, we can gravitate away from conflicting interests toward those interests that we have in common. And so negotiation and diplomacy is all about maximizing those common interests and lessening the areas of conflicting interests. Now, what forms does institutional cooperation take, and why do we need institutions to cooperate? Well, first of all, what is an institution? An institution is a set of agreed upon rules, norms, principles, and procedures to guide cooperation. It's basically a guidebook or a rule book for how states cooperate. And the cooperation hopefully will lead them to win-win solutions. Now, what is the difference then between informal or ad hoc cooperation and formal or institutionalized cooperation? Well, let's take an example of the early days of automobiles, where you had, let's imagine that we have an intersection of two roads, and there were roads before autos, right? Because there were horses and horse-drawn carts. So first couple cars, they're heading toward an intersection, and at the current speeds, they're going to crash if somebody doesn't slow down or stop. So the question is, how do they decide who slows down or who speeds up, for that matter? How do they make adjustment to ensure that they don't realize the most conflicting interests and instead move toward the common interest of both getting through the intersection safely? Well, one thing that they could do is to wave out the door and wave at each other, and they both are saying, "Come on through, come on through." Well, you could try that. You could shout. There's a lot of opportunity there for miscommunication, for misunderstanding. You might both think that you were waved through and then end up crashing. So that's not a very efficient way to engage in cooperation. It's not very effective, right? You could both stop, get out of your car, and meet in the middle, and then negotiate who goes first. Again, it could work. You could reach an agreement. You could end up solving the problem. It's not that ad hoc cooperation doesn't work in the end. It's that it's very inefficient. It has what we call high transaction costs. Transaction costs are the costliness of negotiating, the costliness of reaching a win-win solution. The time that's involved, the communication, the inefficiency. So, on the other hand, if you put a stoplight over that intersection, and you both agree on certain rules, the rule that red means stop, green means go. In that case, cooperation becomes institutionalized. It's no longer ad hoc, it's formal, it's institutional. You've agreed upon certain rules of the game, and that's a very efficient solution. It's one that's worked all over the world, right? Both sides know when to stop, when to go, and it allows you to avoid accidents and to cooperate very efficiently. Notice that some argue that under anarchy, where you don't have any central government, that this kind of solution doesn't work. Because the argument is that you need a police force of traffic cops who will write tickets for people who run red lights, and that in the absence of some enforcement mechanism, that these rules will get violated and will break down. But in fact, most people, most of the time, follow the red light, green light rules, even when there's no police officers anywhere in the vicinity. So it becomes a kind of agreed upon social norm that doesn't necessarily require enforcement or punishment in order to work. So that's one advantage of institutionalized cooperation, is that it lowers the transaction costs. Another example that helps to illustrate the advantages of institutions is the used car example. So, one of the worries that buyers have when they buy a used car is, well, what if there's something wrong with the car that I can't, detect just from looking at it or even from taking a test drive? What if the seller is hiding a defect from me and trying to get me to pay the full price for a used car, for a used car that has no defects, um, even though this car has problems that I'll find out later. Well, that's a problem. That's a worry. And one of this is called asymmetrical information. It's where one side has private information not available to the other side. The used car dealer knows things about the car that you don't know. Now, when there are asymmetries in information, when both sides don't have equal information or can't be confident that they have equal information, then deals that would be profitable for both sides end up not occurring at all, or occur at a lower price. So obviously, for the buyer, it's not good to have uncertainty about the actual condition of the car, but it's also bad for the used car dealer, because if the buyer is worried that you are hiding defects, they're going to offer you less money, right? They're going to build the risk that you are hiding defects into the price they're willing to pay, lowering the price. If they could be certain that all known defects were revealed to them, then they could set the price appropriately and know exactly how much this car is worth. But if they can't, then they just lowball it. That's bad for used car dealers. Now, the way that we fix this is through lemon laws, right? Where dealers have a legal obligation to reveal any defects. And then that becomes even better when you have something like Carfax, where a third party tracks all known accidents happen to a given car, and you can print out a report and see if the car's been in an accident and what kind of damage was done. So that those laws then institutionalize a kind of equitable information sharing that allows deals to take place at the proper price. Now, that's what international institutions do in a way, right? That they provide information. For instance, the IMF, the World Bank, they gather all kinds of data from countries on their economies and make that data available to everybody, and as a way of equalizing information, so that when you go into a trade negotiation, you know what the prices are of goods, you know what the a country's imports and exports are, and that sort of thing. So by equalizing access to information, a good example is arms control, where each side, nuclear arms control, each side, the U.S. and Soviet Union, allowed, at one time they allowed overflights where reconnaissance planes could fly over the territory of the other side, or satellites were allowed to, fly over and take images of nuclear facilities to kind of check to make sure that the other side wasn't cheating. So information sharing allows greater confidence in and therefore bargains to take place that otherwise wouldn't. International institutions, they define the rules. They let you know what exactly counts as cheating. They also prescribe what are the appropriate remedies. It may not be a central government to enforce the rules, but it tells, for instance, in trade, if country A is cheating on a trade deal with country B, then the deal will set out what trade country B can do in retaliation to try to impose some costs on A for cheating. So that's what institutions do. They move us from ad hoc informal cooperation, which is very inefficient, where information asymmetries block good deals, into a more formal and institutionalized kind of cooperation, where information's equitable, cheating is defined, rules are clear, etc. Now, below are some examples, sort of an alphabet soup of institutions: the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, World Trade Organization, National North Atlantic Treaty Organization, etc. And in fact, we've seen a growth of international institutions. You can see since 1979 there at the bottom, the red shows an enormous growth in the number of IGOs, or intergovernmental organizations. We also have non-governmental organizations, or international non-governmental organizations. They've grown even much more rapidly. So the overall level of institutionalized cooperation, both among states but also among non-state actors, has grown enormously in recent decades. Now, what do institutions, therefore, have to do with peace? Well, first of all, there's an indirect effect, because institutions help states get to win-win solutions on the environment, on economics, on battling a pandemic, all kinds of ways in which countries benefit from mutual cooperation. And those are made more likely and more efficient by virtue of institutions. Now, once states are embedded in these cooperative institutions, then the price of conflict rises, because conflict, especially conflict that can lead to war, would threaten to disrupt otherwise profitable and mutually beneficial cooperation. So the more cooperation you have, then the more opportunity cost is what we call it, the more you have to give up if conflict spins out of control. So states have an incentive to avoid conflict. There's also a direct effect, because some institutions are focused on enhancing security so that states feel less insecure. Remember, insecurity drives conflict and war. So you have institutions like collective security organizations, you have arms control, you have peacekeeping forces, all of which directly try to reduce insecurity and resolve conflict. This shows us the rise of peacekeeping forces. Again, in the last few decades, an enormous growth in United Nations forces deployed usually to try to resolve or to prevent the reemergence of civil wars. You can see that a large number of peacekeepers are located in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. So institutional liberalism describes one pathway by which we get from conflict to cooperation. All right, we'll come back and continue our discussion of liberalism in the next lecture. Thanks.